It sounds unbelievable, I know, but for an outstanding fee of less than $100, my HOA unilaterally sold my family's home at a public auction. I'm not talking about some shack or a rundown rental property. I'm talking about the house we built, the one with the garden I'd been cultivating for years. They put it on the market and sold it to the highest bidder in the middle of a Thursday morning. This all started from what should have been a simple conversation, a minor administrative oversight that spiraled into a bureaucratic nightmare of their own making. I remember my initial shock turning into a cold, calculated fury as I fought them at every turn, attempting to reason with them, to pay what was owed, to stop this insane process. Each of my attempts was met with a wall of smug, bureaucratic silence and a passive-aggressive smugness that made it clear they enjoyed the control they had. What they failed to realize, however, was that their overzealous, predatory process was fundamentally flawed legally and ethically. They thought they had me cornered. They thought they had won. They thought they could simply take what was mine and walk away. They were wrong. Their very overreach was their first catastrophic mistake, the fatal flaw in their grand, petty plan. It set in motion a legal process that not only returned my property to me, but resulted in the dismantling of their entire organization. It's a story of how a small act of tyranny, unchecked and unopposed, can unravel into a complete and utter legal and financial defeat. Stick around, and I'll tell you exactly how this petty little empire crumbled. My wife and I, for a few years, had lived a life of quiet, suburban contentment. Our home in the Whispering Pines community was exactly what we'd worked for. A peaceful corner of the world where the loudest noise was the rustle of leaves in the trees, and the most stressful event was deciding what to plant in the braced garden next spring. We took immense pride in our property, in keeping the lawn perfectly manicured, the flower beds vibrant, and the porch welcoming. The rules of the Homeowners Association, or HOA, felt like a reasonable trade-off for the manicured streets and the sense of community. They seemed like simple, logical guidelines designed to maintain property values, not a set of tools to be weaponized. I was naive, of course, to believe that. I should have known that something was amiss the first time I met Karen. She was the HOA president, a woman who seemed to have weaponized politeness. She carried a clipboard with a death grip, and her smile never quite reached her eyes. Karen was a study in cold precision, a woman who had somehow found a way to use the association's perfectly reasonable covenants to feed a deep, unquenchable need for control and drama. Her favorite phrase was, "It's all in the bylaws," delivered with a tone that implied any deviation was a personal affront to her and the entire concept of civilized society. She saw the rules not as a framework for mutual benefit, but as a bludgeon with which to enforce her personal will. This story, the one that almost cost my family everything, began not with a grand conflict, but with something incredibly small, a $25 annual administrative fee, a tiny, easily fixable oversight, a minor detail buried in a sea of paperwork that, to most, would have been a non-issue. I had forgotten to pay it, and to be honest, I hadn't even realized it was due. It was Karen, of course, who flagged it. That minuscule, missing fee was the tiny, seemingly harmless seed from which this monstrous legal battle grew. A battle that would expose the rot at the core of her authority and the entire organization. But before we get into the details of the conflict itself, I'm curious. Have you ever had a run-in with a neighbor like Karen, a self-appointed ruler of the cul-de-sac? Let me know about the worst neighbor you've ever had to deal with in the comments below. And while you're at it, please like this video. Your engagement helps me keep telling these stories. The initial notification was just a form letter, a polite reminder about the fee. It was simple, logical, and had a clear due date. I remember thinking to myself, no problem, I'll just pay it online. But a few days later, a second notice arrived, followed by a third, each one a little more insistent than the last. Despite the fact that I had already attempted to pay, a strange feeling of unease began to creep in. It was a feeling I'd soon come to know all too well. The feeling that I was no longer a homeowner in a friendly community, but a target in someone else's petty game. And that feeling, it was only just beginning. That strange feeling of unease quickly turned into a creeping sense of dread as I began my good faith attempts to pay the fine. My first move was to log on to the HOA's website, assuming there would be a simple button to click or a form to fill out. Instead, I found a broken, outdated page with no payment portal, only a static message directing residents to send a certified check via mail. This was the first hurdle, and while it was annoying, it wasn't insurmountable. I wrote the check, sent it off with a confirmation of delivery, and assumed the matter was closed. A week later, I received another letter, this one with a sharp red stamp on it that read, "Past due." My hands tightened on the paper. The letter stated that not only had my payment not been received, but a late fee had been assessed, a punitive charge that had ballooned the original $25 into $150. I was stunned. I immediately called the HOA's main number, which routed me directly to a voicemail box that was, of course, full. I tried again and again. I then drove to the community center, the supposed heart of the HOA operations, only to find the office locked with a hand-scribbled note on the door that simply said, "Closed." The hours listed on the note were only from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m., Monday through Wednesday. I worked an 8 to 5 job, Monday through Friday. It was becoming clear that this wasn't an oversight. It was a carefully constructed trap. I returned home, my frustration boiling over, and sent an email to the general HOA address, attaching a picture of my certified mail receipt. I wrote a long, detailed account of my attempts to pay, trying to sound as reasonable as possible. I stated my clear intention to resolve the issue and asked for a proper means to do so. A full day passed with no response. I sent another email. Nothing. The days turned into a week, and then 2. And the letters from the HOA kept arriving, each one colder and more threatening than the last. The late fees began to compound at an absurd rate, turning the $150 into $200, then $500, then nearly $1,000. It was no longer about a small administrative fee. It was about their desire to punish and control. My wife began to worry, asking me if we should just pay the absurd amount to make it go away. "Why should we?" I asked her, a calm righteousness settling over me. "We tried to pay the initial fee. We have a paper trail. They are the ones being unreasonable." I believe that a rational person would eventually see the situation for what it was and back down. But I was dealing with Karen, and I was beginning to learn that there was nothing rational about her motivations. One evening, I saw her walking her tiny yapping dog down the street. It was late, and she was alone, a rare sight. I decided this was my chance. I walked up to her, keeping my tone polite and even, despite my internal turmoil. "Karen," I began, "I've been trying to get in touch with you about my outstanding HOA fees. There seems to be a clerical issue, and I haven't been able to get a hold of anyone." She stopped walking and turned to face me, a faint, cold smile touching her lips. "Oh, I'm aware, Mr. Hayes. I've seen your emails. You're quite persistent." I explained the situation, the returned checks, the unreturned calls, the compounding fees. I told her I was happy to pay the initial amount, but the exorbitant late fees were ridiculous. Her smile never faded. She just nodded, her eyes boring into mine. "The bylaws are very clear, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice a low, condescending whisper. "The fees are non-negotiable once a certain period has passed. It is your responsibility to ensure timely payment. This is a very serious matter." I pointed out that I had attempted to pay, that it was the HOA's lack of accessible payment options that was the issue. Her face hardened, and her knuckles turned white as she gripped her clipboard. Perhaps you should have been more diligent, she said with a chilling finality. These things have a way of escalating, and when they do, well, they have much bigger consequences than a few late fees. Bigger plans for your property, in fact. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the twilight, her words echoing in my mind. Bigger plans for my property. That wasn't just a threat about money. It was a promise of something far more sinister, and I had no idea just how serious she was. Karen's chilling words about bigger plans for my property had haunted me for weeks, but I still couldn't have predicted the utter absurdity of what happened next. One afternoon, a certified letter arrived from a legal firm I'd never heard of. I opened it with a knot of dread in my stomach, my hands shaking slightly. The letter was a formal notice, cold and unfeeling in its legal language. It stated that due to outstanding debts to the HOA, my property was being put up for a public foreclosure auction. The date was set for the following Tuesday. I read the line again, my mind struggling to process the words. Public foreclosure auction. My blood ran cold, and the paper slipped from my numb fingers. This wasn't just a threat anymore. It was happening. It was a chaotic moment of sickening realization. The letter was dated 2 weeks prior, meaning the auction was just days away, held with laughably inadequate notice. The HOA, led by Karen, had sidestepped every reasonable, human interaction and gone directly to the most extreme measure possible over a negligible sum, a few $100s in supposed late fees on a $25 fine. The sheer audacity of it, the malice, was breathtaking. I was no longer just an annoyed homeowner. I was a victim of a predatory, bureaucratic machine. I immediately called my wife, my voice raw and tight. I told her to come home. When she did, her face drained of all color as she read the letter. We both felt the ground crumble beneath our feet. This was an unforgivable legal and ethical line they had crossed. This wasn't a warning. It was an act of war, and it had been conducted in the most cowardly way possible behind our backs and in the shadows of legal fine print. We frantically tried to find a lawyer, but it was a Friday, and every office we called was either closed for the weekend or too booked to take on an emergency case. We were on our own for the next 4 days. My mind, which had been so calm and righteous, became a frantic racing torrent of thoughts. What were they thinking? Did they actually believe they could get away with this? My fury was no longer a slow burn. It was a white-hot furnace of controlled rage. I spent the entire weekend gathering every piece of paper I had related to the HOA, every letter they sent, every email I wrote, the certified mail receipt for the check they claimed never arrived. I had everything. All the proof that I had acted in good faith and that they had not. This wasn't just about my home anymore. It was about exposing a corrupt, predatory system. The following Monday, I drove to the community center. I was going to find Karen and make her look me in the eye as she explained this. The office door was, of course, locked. But I saw her tiny sedan parked in the lot and her yapping dog sitting in the front seat. I knew she was there. I knocked on the door, then I banged on it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door opened a crack and Karen peered out, her face a mask of annoyance. I told you, Mr. Hayes, the office is closed. You sold my house, I said, my voice low and steady. I didn't shout. I didn't plead. I just stated the fact. Her eyes narrowed, and a faint smirk appeared on her face. That's a matter of public record, isn't it? She said, pushing the door open slightly more. It's the natural consequence of failing to meet your financial obligations. It's all in the bylaws. Her tone was gloating. She believed she had won. Her smugness was a tangible thing, almost a physical force in the air between us. You're a disgrace, I said, the words cutting through the air. I tried to pay you and you made it impossible. You refused my money. I have the receipts. The dates, the times. You know what you did. Her smirk widened into a full-blown grin. And you know what they say, Mr. Hayes? Possession is 9/10 of the law. You can have all the receipts you want. This property is no longer yours. She had crossed the line. This wasn't a conflict anymore. It was a direct, explosive confrontation. This was my declaration of war. After our direct confrontation at the community center, Karen may have thought she had the upper hand, but she was about to learn a fundamental truth about paper wars. The person with the most organized stack of documents always wins. Her chilling words about possession being 9/10 of the law were a challenge, not a victory. And in that moment, my mindset shifted from that of a victim to a meticulous strategist. I understood that this wasn't about yelling or pleading. It was about building an insurmountable case, one document at a time. I was no longer on the defensive. I was going on the offensive. I immediately began the painstaking process of organizing every single piece of evidence I had. I laid it all out on the dining room table, the stack of their increasingly threatening letters, each one a different shade of passive-aggressive. My own meticulously kept records of every payment attempt, including the tracking number for the certified check they claimed never received, the screenshots of their broken website with the unclickable payment link, the email chain where I politely and repeatedly tried to get a hold of them. I even printed out the cryptic voicemail notifications from their perpetually full inbox. My wife and I spent hours marking each item with sticky notes, creating a timeline of their deliberate stonewalling. This wasn't just a collection of papers. It was a roadmap of their bad faith and negligence. But I knew this wasn't enough. I needed more than just a paper trail of my good intentions. I needed to prove their malice. I remembered hearing from a few neighbors that some of the old HOA board members had abruptly quit. The story went that they couldn't deal with Karen's abusive behavior and her tendency to go rogue. A light bulb went off. I found one of their old numbers and made a cold call. His name was Frank, and he was initially reluctant to talk. "Look, man, I'm out of that circus for good," he said with a weary sigh. But as I explained what had happened to my house, his tone changed. His silence on the other end of the line was heavy. "She always pulled stuff like this," he finally said, his voice low with disgust. "She'd manipulate the bylaws, make up her own rules. We always told her that her methods weren't legally sound, but she'd just wave her hand and say she had everything under control." He confirmed that she had been pushing for more aggressive collection policies, a power grab he and others had opposed. I asked if he would be willing to provide a sworn affidavit detailing her unauthorized actions. He hesitated for a moment, then agreed. He said what she had done to me was beyond the pale, and he was done letting her get away with it. Over the next few days, I spoke to 2 other former board members who had similar stories. I had my witnesses, with a comprehensive binder full of their threatening letters, my evidence of payment attempts, and 3 sworn affidavits from former board members. I went on the hunt for a legal team. This time, I was armed. I didn't just want to stop the auction. I wanted justice. I booked a meeting with a specialized real estate attorney, a man with a reputation for being a shark. I walked into his office, placed the thick binder on his desk, and laid out the entire story, calmly and methodically, like a prosecutor presenting a case. He listened without interruption, his eyes scanning the documents. When I finished, he closed the binder with a snap and looked at me with a cold smile that was unnervingly similar to Karen's. "So, they went for a non-judicial foreclosure on the basis of a fraudulent debt," he said, more to himself than to me. He leaned forward, the smile never leaving his lips. "Mr. Hayes, they didn't just break the law. They broke about 6 of them." He picked up the binder and held it in his hand, a look of pure satisfaction on his face. "We don't just win this," he said. "We end them." I knew, in that moment, that the tide had turned. I was no longer fighting alone. I had the law on my side, and an attorney who was just as determined as I was to see justice served. That chilling promise from my attorney, "We don't just win this, we end them," was the last thing I heard before our case went to court. It was a promise he would absolutely keep. The climax of this entire saga wasn't a shouting match or a dramatic public display. It was a quiet, cold, and utterly methodical dismantling of the HOA's entire case in a small, sterile courtroom. Karen was there, of course, sitting at a table with the HOA's lawyer, a nervous-looking man in a suit a few sizes too big for him. She wore a perfectly tailored blazer and a smug, practiced smile, a mask of confidence that I knew, deep down, was a thin facade. The hearing began, and my attorney, a man whose presence filled the room, started his opening statement. He spoke calmly, without a single wasted word. He laid out the facts, not the narrative, but the cold, hard, documented facts of the case. He explained that a valid debt had never existed, that I had attempted to pay the initial fee, and that the HOA had actively blocked those attempts. He then laid out the series of escalating unauthorized fees that followed. He called his first witness to the stand, Frank, the former HOA board member. Frank's testimony was a masterclass in controlled, damning revelation. He calmly explained how Karen had manipulated the board, lied about their support for her aggressive collection policies, and routinely abused her power. He had brought personal notes, which he used to confirm dates and details of meetings where she had ignored his legal advice and that of other board members. As he spoke, I watched Karen's perfectly composed demeanor begin to crack. Her shoulders, which had been so straight and confident, began to slump ever so slightly. She shifted in her seat, her eyes darting nervously between Frank and the judge. The prosecutor then brought up a second former board member, who confirmed Frank's testimony, adding his own details about how she had boasted about making an example of me. The mask of confidence was now visibly slipping. Then came the centerpiece of our case. My attorney placed the thick binder of my evidence on a pedestal in front of the judge. He went through it page by page, document by document, each one a nail in the HOA's coffin. He showed the certified mail receipt for the check they claimed never received. He held up a copy of their own bylaws, pointing to the sections they had violated in their illegal foreclosure process. He presented the screenshots of the broken payment portal, proving they had knowingly made it impossible to pay online. With each piece of evidence, Karen's face grew paler. Her lips thinned into a tight, angry line. Finally, it was her turn to testify. She took the stand, her voice dripping with condescension as she denied every accusation. She claimed my payments were late, that my complaints were a slanderous smear campaign, and that the HOA had acted within its rights. She was so confident in her own lie that she practically radiated smugness. But my attorney was ready. He presented her with my evidence, one piece at a time, each one a direct refutation of her claims. When he produced the sworn affidavits from her former colleagues, her eyes widened in a moment of pure, unadulterated shock. She looked at me, and in her eyes, I saw not anger, but a fleeting moment of cold, pure malice. She knew she had been outmaneuvered. Her carefully constructed house of cards was falling. The judge, a man who had listened silently and stoically, cleared his throat. He looked directly at Karen, his voice firm and final. "Karen, your testimony is inconsistent with the evidence provided. The court finds that the HOA's foreclosure on Mr. Hayes's property was fraudulent, unauthorized, and a blatant violation of both your own bylaws and state law," he continued, and his words were the sweetest music I have ever heard. "The sale of this property is hereby voided. The HOA is to return the title to the rightful owners immediately, and furthermore, due to the egregious and malicious nature of your actions, the HOA will be held responsible for all of Mr. Hayes's legal fees and court costs. The look on Karen's face as the judge delivered the ruling was one I will never forget. Her mask of composure didn't just crack, it shattered. Her face flushed a deep mottled red, and her jaw went slack in a perfect portrait of shock and disbelief. She had been so certain of her victory, so sure that her petty tyranny was untouchable. But in a quiet courtroom, in a moment of pure, undeniable justice, her entire world came crashing down. The cathartic rush I felt in that moment was indescribable. It wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for anyone who has ever faced a petty bully and refused to back down. Karen's stunned, defeated expression in that courtroom was one of the most satisfying sights of my life, but it was nothing compared to the long-term fallout that followed. The judge's ruling, which voided the illegal sale of my home and condemned the HOA's actions, was a complete and utter legal defeat for them, but it was just the beginning of their real punishment. Because the court found that the HOA's actions were egregious and malicious, my attorney didn't just go after their assets, he went after theirs. The lawsuit became a class action, and as other homeowners realized they had also been victims of the HOA's predatory tactics, they joined the case. The HOA, unable to cover the massive legal fees they had incurred, had no choice but to declare bankruptcy. The financial ruin was swift and absolute. Karen, as the driving force behind the illegal foreclosure, was personally sanctioned for a significant portion of our legal fees. It was a punishment that fit the crime. Her arrogance and need for control had not only brought down the organization she so meticulously managed, but had now cost her a substantial portion of her own personal wealth. The new board members, who had taken over after the old ones quit, immediately resigned in a wave of shame and disgust, and within a few months, a community meeting was held to vote on the HOA's fate. The residents of Whispering Pines, finally having a voice and a reason to use it, overwhelmingly voted to disband the HOA entirely. The very system that Karen had used to terrorize us was now gone forever, a monument to her spectacular failure. Without the covenants and the endless petty rules, the neighborhood began to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Our lives, which had been put on hold for the duration of the lawsuit, finally returned to normal. The home that they had tried to steal from us was now truly ours, a symbol of our victory and the peace we had fought so hard to regain. It was no longer just a house. It was a home that represented the triumph of reason over tyranny. I don't hate Karen. To hate her would be to give her power she no longer has. Instead, I feel a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing that justice was served. The lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that sometimes the only way to stop a bully, whether it's on a playground or in an HOA meeting, is to meet their pettiness with an overwhelming display of rational, well-documented, and legally sound force. You don't have to be angry, you just have to be right, and you have to be ready to prove it. In the end, Karen's thirst for power and control led to her downfall, and in a way, it was a poetic and fitting ending. She lost everything she had worked for, and, in the process, gave our community the greatest gift of all, freedom. And that, I've come to believe, is a victory more valuable than anything a petty tyrant could ever take.